War has a dark side, revealing brutal tactics that often shock us. The Vietnam War was no different, showcasing horrifying traps that added a terrifying dimension to the conflict. This exploration uncovers some of the most gruesome methods employed during this period. From hidden spike pits to intricate tunnel systems, these traps were designed to inflict maximum damage and instill fear in the enemy. So join us as we unravel the stories behind these horrifying instruments of destruction, offering a sobering glimpse into the harsh realities of Vietnam's battlegrounds. Viet Cong's deadly guerrilla traps. In the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong became famous for their smart and successful ways of fighting against the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. They were known for their Viet Cong guerrilla tactics, which were clever strategies used to outsmart their enemies in the thick forest and rice fields of Vietnam. From the late 1950s to the 1960s, the Viet Cong came up with a detailed plan to deal with the stronger weapons and resources of their opponents. They were good at blending in with the locals and using the land to their benefit. They knew that surprising their enemy was their best strategy. A big part of their tactics was creating a huge network of tunnels like the Cu Chi tunnels near Ho Chi Minh City. These tunnels, hidden under villages, let the Viet Cong move without being seen and escape from the enemy. They were also used as homes, storage, and even hospitals for the fighters. Now the Cu Chi tunnels are a place where tourists can see how clever and tough the Viet Cong was. The most famous thing the Viet Cong did was set traps. These simple but smart traps were meant to hurt, kill, or scare enemy soldiers. For example, punji sticks were sharp bamboo stakes hidden in the ground and covered with stuff that could cause infections. These traps were horrifying for the enemy soldiers and caused a lot of injuries, making it hard for them to move around. General Vo Nguyen Giap, a well-known historical figure, was linked to the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics. He led many of their successful fights. His quote, "We will fight the enemy with our cunning and make them die in their anger," shows the Viet Cong's will to use their smarts to win against tough odds. Beside the traps, the Viet Cong used other creative ways to hurt their enemies. They set up booby traps like the bouncing Betty mines and changed hand grenades to surprise soldiers and cause serious injuries. Other traps like nets and falling traps caught enemy troops and left them more open to attacks. The psychological part of the Viet Cong's tactics was also important. They wanted to scare their enemies by using poisonous animals like snakes and scorpions in their traps and messing with their food and water. Their goal was to make the enemy soldiers always worry about their safety and feel less sure of themselves, which would eventually make them not want to fight anymore. These underground strongholds were a key part of their strategy, with the Viet Cong's sneaky traps causing chaos. Let's shine the spotlight on one of their deadliest creations, the punji stick. The punji stick nightmare. The Viet Cong used punji sticks, which were basically sharpened bamboo sticks hidden in the ground, to really hurt and scare the enemy soldiers. It was a clever way to use what they had around them to make something so dangerous. These traps were usually set up where the U.S. and South Vietnamese troops would walk or hide in the jungle or by rivers, and even near the entrances of the Cu Chi tunnels to stop anyone trying to get in. To make these punji sticks even nastier, the Viet Cong would sometimes put poison or waste on them, so even a small cut could turn into a big problem with infections. These traps weren't new. They were used against the French before, but during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong got really good at making and placing them. There's a story about a U.S. Marine named Frank Harbert who stepped on one in 1968. He said it hurt like crazy and he was out of action for weeks. These traps didn't just hurt physically. They messed with the soldiers' heads, making them scared and less careful. The U.S. and South Vietnamese tried to deal with these traps by making tough boots and having scouts check for traps. They also tried to stay away from places where the traps were likely to be, but the Viet Cong kept changing their tactics, making even more tricky traps that could snap shut and cause really bad injuries. Now let's dig deeper into the underground world of the Cu Chi tunnels, where the Viet Cong turned hidden secrets into a deadly advantage against their enemies. The Tunnels of Terror. The Cu Chi tunnels were like a huge underground city stretching over 250 kilometers, and they were very important for the Viet Cong soldiers during the war. They started making them around the late 1940s and kept at it until the 60s. These tunnels ran from the edge of Saigon to the border with Cambodia. They were a secret spot for the Viet Cong to plan surprise attacks, move stuff around, and to be able to hide from the enemy. Living in the Cu Chi tunnels wasn't a walk in the park. It was very cramped and stuffy, and there was always the risk of getting caught. But the Viet Cong were clever. They had everything they needed down there to stay for a long time, places to sleep, have meetings, cook, and even treat injured comrades. The design of the tunnels was pretty smart. They had different levels and secret doors that were really well hidden, some under houses, some looking like anthills, and others underwater or in rice fields. And to keep out unwanted guests, they set up traps everywhere, like spike pits and tripwires hooked up to bombs. The American and South Vietnamese forces didn't even know about these tunnels until the early 1960s. When they finally caught on, they tried really hard to find and destroy them. That's when they came up with the tunnel rats. These were brave soldiers who'd squeeze into the tight, dark tunnels to look for Viet Cong fighters and defuse traps. One of these tunnel rats, Sergeant Samuel Orozco, said it was always tense because you never knew what was around the corner, a booby trap, a snake, or an enemy soldier. Even though the tunnel rats did their best, the Cu Chi tunnels were still a big problem for the U.S. and South Vietnamese armies. The Viet Cong knew their way around the tunnels so well that they could hit and run without leaving a trace, which frustrated and wore down the other side. There were a couple of big fights at the Cu Chi tunnels, like the Battle of Cu Chi in 1966 and Operation Cedar Falls in 1967. In the Battle of Cu Chi, the U.S. tried to take down the tunnel network, but the Viet Cong got away and came back later. Operation Cedar Falls was a huge mission to clear out the Viet Cong from an area called the Iron Triangle, which included the Cu Chi tunnels. They managed to wreck a lot of the tunnels, but the Viet Cong just rebuilt them and kept on fighting. If the tunnels of terror and the cunning traps hidden within them gave you chills, brace yourself for an even more sinister arsenal in the Viet Cong's bag of tricks. Tales of booby traps and mines. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong used sneaky tactics like booby traps and landmines to mess with the heads of U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. These traps weren't just about causing physical harm. They were all about messing with the enemy's morale and making their lives miserable. One of their nastiest tricks was the Bouncing Betty, a wicked mine that could jump up into the air before blowing up, causing serious damage to anyone nearby. They got their hands on these mines from all sorts of places, like nabbing them from captured enemies or getting secret deliveries from sympathetic countries. But it wasn't just the Bouncing Betty. They had a whole bag of tricks. Toe poppers, which were tiny mines meant to maim, not kill, and tripwire mines that would go boom if you accidentally messed with a hidden wire. Some traps were so sneaky they looked like everyday stuff, like rocks or leaves, blending right into the environment. One crafty trap they used was the grenade in a can. Imagine stepping on what looks like an innocent tin can, only for it to set off a grenade hidden inside. These traps were a constant worry for soldiers, always keeping them on edge, never knowing if the next step could be their last. These traps took a heavy toll, causing casualties and messing with soldiers' heads. Stories spread like wildfire about soldiers losing limbs or worse to these hidden dangers, making everyone nervous. Private Leonard Thompson summed it up very well, saying every step felt like a gamble with your life. To fight back, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces got smart. They used minesweepers and fancy gear to find and disarm these traps. They trained soldiers to spot danger zones and even used aerial recon to plan safe routes. But even with all that, the fear of those sneaky traps never really went away. Traps of death. The Viet Cong were clever in their tactics, especially with their use of traps. Simple yet genius nets and falling traps not only stopped, but also rattled the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. These traps weren't just physical barriers, they were psychological warfare, a constant threat lurking in the minds of soldiers. Let's talk about those net traps, also known as man catchers. Imagine a large net cunningly hidden with leaves and sticks, waiting silently on the ground. As soon as an unwary soldier stepped on it, a rope would yank the net up, trapping the soldier in midair like a helpless puppet. And guess what? They often paired these with sneaky tripwires and sharp sticks to make sure the message was clear. Tread carefully. There's a famous incident from 1966 during Operation Attleboro where Sergeant Michael O'Brien found himself dangling from a tree, courtesy of a net trap. His quick-thinking comrades rescued him, but the shock stayed with him, an unforgettable lesson in the Viet Cong's craftiness. Now let's shift to falling traps. These were diabolical creations, camouflage pits of doom filled with spikes or other nasties. The dreaded tiger trap was particularly feared, a pit filled with bamboo stakes, sometimes coated with poison or filth to ensure infections. Lieutenant Tran Van Tuan's chilling account of a comrade falling into one paints a clear picture of the horror these traps held. These traps weren't just about physical harm, they were psychological warfare at its finest. It's incredible how something so seemingly simple could be so effective. Snakes and scorpions in the Viet Cong's arsenal. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong were masters of using nature's deadliest creatures and clever sabotage to create fear and chaos. They didn't just rely on guns and bombs. They used snakes and scorpions, hiding them in sneaky places like hidden compartments or soldiers' sleeping areas. Imagine waking up to a venomous snake in your bag. These tactics weren't just terrifying, they were effective. Take Corporal John Harker's experience. He got bitten by a deadly snake while on patrol. His quick-thinking comrades saved him, but it left him with a lifelong fear of snakes. That's the power of psychological warfare. The Viet Cong didn't stop there. They poisoned food and water supplies, creating constant paranoia among enemy troops. Finding poisoned rice or water caches became a grim routine for American and South Vietnamese forces. It's like they turned survival into a game of Russian roulette. But what's even scarier is how they used these tactics on their own people. Threatening deserters or collaborators with poison shows just how far they were willing to go to maintain control. Then there were their wire traps, simple yet deadly. Snap traps were like something out of a horror story, causing sudden and severe injuries. Private James O'Neill's encounter with a snap trap paints a vivid picture of the dangers lurking in the jungle. Slide traps were equally terrifying, causing victims to lose their footing and fall into pits of sharpened stakes. Lieutenant Tran Quoc Hung's story is heartbreaking, a simple tripwire leading to a deadly slide trap. These tactics weren't just about physical harm, they were about instilling fear and insecurity, turning the jungles of Vietnam into a nightmarish battleground where danger lurked at every turn. Sniffing out danger in Vietnam's jungle traps. Back in the Vietnam War, American and South Vietnamese troops were facing the Viet Cong and their deadly traps like a game of hide and seek, but with serious consequences. Thankfully, some clever minds like Captain Ernest Ernie Brace stepped in to turn the tables. Brace, an Army engineer, lands in Vietnam in 1963 and sees firsthand the havoc these traps wreaked on his comrades. That's when he rolls up his sleeves and gets to work. He studies the enemy's traps, teams up with locals for insights, and soon becomes the trap-busting hero. With knowledge as their weapon, Brace and his crew teach soldiers how to spot tampered plants, disturbed soil, and sneaky tripwires. They even come up with cool tools like the trap probe, a trap-detecting wand. Imagine soldiers poking the ground like treasure hunters, but for traps. But wait, there's more. Canine superstars join the squad. These smart pups sniff out trouble, literally, by detecting human scents and disturbed earth. They're not just heroes, they're furry morale boosters for the troops. Now let's zoom out to history's big picture. Deception has always been a player in military games. Take the Korean War, for instance. Both sides, North and South Korea, pulled off some sneaky moves. North Korea hid its artillery like a magician's disappearing act, while South Korea and their allies spread fake news to bamboozle the enemy. And who can forget World War II's epic mind games? The Allies cooked up plans with fake armies and phantom radio chatter, and even tricked the Germans with a fake dead guy carrying fake invasion plans. Even way back in ancient times, trickery ruled. Think of the Trojan horse sneaking Greek soldiers into Troy, or Sun Tzu's timeless wisdom about winning wars through cunning and deception. It's like a never-ending chess game, where brains often triumph over brawn, proving that in war, a sharp mind is the ultimate weapon. The ongoing threat of Viet Cong booby traps. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong's skill with booby traps left a lasting mark, not just on the soldiers who faced them, but on the entire landscape of the region. These traps, simple yet deadly, caused immense physical harm and deeply affected the morale and strategies of U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Imagine the scene: soldiers navigating through dense jungles, always on edge, never sure if their next step would trigger a trap. This constant threat took a toll, not just physically, but mentally. The fear of injury or death created stress and anxiety, dampening the soldiers' fighting spirit and causing disillusionment with the war effort. The Viet Cong's traps were so elusive and effective that traditional military tactics faltered. Soldiers had to adapt, relying more on small unit tactics and risky missions in hostile territory. This constant adaptation exposed them to even more danger, creating a cycle of fear and adjustment. But the impact wasn't confined to the soldiers alone. Even today, the scars of these traps mar the landscapes of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Unexploded traps or ordnances remain hidden, posing a daily threat to the locals who traverse these areas. One poignant story is that of Akira, a former child soldier turned humanitarian. After the war, he dedicated his life to clearing landmines and traps and establishing a museum and relief center to raise awareness of their lasting effects. His work has not only saved lives, but also highlighted the enduring legacy of these devices on the region and its people. The Vietnam War was like stepping into a world of constant danger and fear, and the Viet Cong had a sneaky way of making everything even scarier. Imagine walking through a dense jungle, not knowing if your next step could be your last. John Thompson, a brave U.S. Army veteran, remembers one such chilling moment from his time in Vietnam. His platoon was sent to check out a possible Viet Cong supply spot. As they crept through the trees, a tripwire suddenly went off, setting off an explosion. One of Thompson's comrades was badly hurt. That moment stuck with Thompson, who said the scariest part of the war was never knowing where danger lurked. It felt like it was everywhere. Then there's James Walker, who was part of a reconnaissance patrol. Their job was to move silently through the bushes, gathering info on the enemy. One day, he felt a sharp pain in his leg. A bamboo stick from a Viet Cong wire trap had jabbed him. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the fear of what else could be hiding out there. Even Patricia Johnson, a nurse working in a field hospital, saw how brutal these traps could be. She talked about a young soldier who got caught in a trap with venomous snakes. Despite all they did, they couldn't save him. Johnson and her team felt powerless against such hidden dangers. Charles Nguyen, a former South Vietnamese soldier, has a haunting memory from his time as a prisoner of the Viet Cong. They made his fellow soldiers wear bamboo cages filled with scorpions around their necks. It was a night of unimaginable horror that stayed with Nguyen long after his release. These stories show the human side of war, the fear, the pain, and the helplessness. It wasn't just about battles. It was about facing the unknown every single day. The Viet Cong's use of booby traps added a layer of terror that still haunts those who lived through it.